So in class we started talking about migration and the global patterns that we see, and we talked about the history. This has been a global process that's really gone on through world history. People are constantly on the move, and the question we'll start looking at is why and what are the push and pull factors that are really behind some of this movement. So in class we talked about where we might want to live and the characteristics you look for. Some of you looked at a more local region, and when we asked where, we're thinking about the United States. And then others had a more global perspective, and so you had a broader world thought in terms of where the characteristics or the places you might want to be. But when we thought about that, most of those things were being considered pull factors, things that you looked for as a positive trait versus some of the other things that could have been a push factor that would want you to leave Minnesota, maybe because you hated the winters. And then we also talked about where your families came from and generationally how quickly that's changed. Depending on our class, we had some pretty interesting backgrounds. And one thing we didn't talk about, but you could look at, would be what were those factors? What were those push and pull factors that influenced your family's history? It's kind of a fascinating thing to consider on a very personal level. So as we look at migration, and some of this we got to in class, just talking about why do people migrate. Part of this is we're constantly in circulation, as the text would define. And this is basically just looking at the idea of human mobility, and that we're in constant movement throughout our lives. And it just depends on how we look at the scale. So it could be something that is like seasonal or cyclical, like a college student going back and forth year to year, going out of state, coming back home for the summer. It could be the same thing with, like, for example, Midwest agriculture. There are those that work, cyclically or seasonally on farms and throughout the state, depending on the time of year, the harvest. We could say the same thing about our resorts, where people, Brainerd, for example, northern Minnesota. It could be even on, if we look at the scale of just a daily commute. If you look at our interstate freeways at certain times of the day, you can start to see that circulation. That being said, we're really focusing on migration, which is the permanent movement of people. And as we look at this, this is really an example of relocation diffusion. People moving, the spread of people and to new places on a permanent basis. One quick distinction is looking at emigration, is going from a location, and so that's something that sometimes is easily sort of mistaken. And one of the things, a quick little help reminder would be thinking of exit. The idea of exiting something would be emigration, so you're leaving a country, whereas if you're going into a country, you're going to have immigration. So as we look at some of these, more specifically, these push and pull factors, this isn't going to be, I'm not going to be able to include all the factors, but we'll highlight some of the key ones that we could, pretty obviously identify in any situation. But really they fall under three major categories, in that they're going to be economic, cultural, or environmental. And primarily economic factors are a huge theme. Usually it's a combination of all three or a couple of them, but economic factors tend to drive a lot of migration in our world today. People looking for better opportunities or better lives. And we can look at this, there's other factors that may or may not be push or pull factors, such as cultural factors. And if we look at push factors, like it would probably be more like forced migrations, where people you see the evidence of refugees, or if we look at the history of something like slavery and the slave trade through the latter half of the second of that period of about 400 years, and you can see if you look at the patterns leaving Africa and primarily West Africa. And then if we were to look at current population centers or densities or concentrations in these locations in the Western Hemisphere or in the Americas, you'd see some lasting impacts of that forced migration. But we could also look at political factors. That could be persecution, whether it's for basic rights. It could be ethnic or racial. It could be a variety of factors, civil wars. It could be conflict between neighboring countries. But political factors are going to affect it. And then environmental factors as well. That could be something as devastating as an earthquake or a flood, or a strain on resources that make it unviable for someone. So if we look at that, just another way of kind of envisioning this, maybe to think about push factors, and you think of push, something that's generally forced. You're pushing it away, and you can see the kinds of things we're looking at in this image here. Whereas the pull factors are going to be the draw. What would make someone want to relocate into a new place? If we take a present map of refugees and where they are today, and some of these migration patterns, what we're seeing more recently, a good one would be taking a look at places like Iraq. We have a world event like a war over the last 10 years, and you can see the migration patterns of people leaving Iraq. Same thing with Afghanistan. Or if we go into the action or movement that you're seeing in Central Africa with some of the conflicts there, it's a pretty significant one. Or if we just look at political impacts, Cuba, where you can see those patterns of people coming to the United States, and we could take that one to more of a political factor. So as we talk about those migration patterns, one of the things that becomes a barrier to that relocation diffusion would be those intervening obstacles. And they can take on a variety of forms. Historically, those have been more environmental. In other words, the physical barriers, the natural physical geography, an ocean, a mountain range, pure distance can really affect the migration of peoples. The image you see here is one coming out of Oklahoma. In the 1920s and 30s, you had the Dust Bowl, and basically you had farmers that lost everything in a horrendous drought, and these are two that were literally walking west, probably towards California. But if you look at a book like The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck talks a lot about this period in basically present day. If you look at Oklahoma. And probably not too far from some of the drought factors we're seeing here, where how would it affect those populations in these areas? But as we move forward and look at more modern context, and really this has been present through the last couple centuries, but it continues to intensify, is that those intervening obstacles are not so much the physical geography. Distance still plays a large role, but with technologies of transportation changing so drastically in the last couple hundred years, it's very much a different type of intervening obstacles. Whether it's looking at huge transport to ships, air travel, high-speed rail, we are more connected than we've ever been, and so that's changed the kind of intervening obstacles that we see today. Why do people migrate? And the distance migration, basically, people think of migration as being country to country, internationally, but in fact most migration happens internally. And so when we look at the types of that internal, really again we're looking at scale, and going from local to global, but taking back to global to local. Interregional would be something that happens from one region to another. That could be looked at as between urban and rural, or going from the Midwest to the West Coast. Changing complete landscape, your cultural landscape changes pretty drastically. Whereas if you have an intra-regional migration, that might be something as simple as relocation to the south side of the Twin Cities for a job relocation, just to make it a shorter commute, for example. So your daily circulation patterns are minimized. So just kind of the scale and how those patterns emerge. As we take this, the international migration and make it on a more global scale, what we're really looking at is then we have two different types, the voluntary and the forced. And really, if we look at the voluntary factors, what would we see would be more of, where we're going to see a factor of the idea of pull factors. We're going to see things that are going to draw people, opportunities, things, maybe it's the impact of chain migration where their families already gone through the process of migration, and then you have the other side that would be forced, where it might be because of conflict, it might be because of persecution. It's going to be more push factor types of migration. So those are going to be the things that are going to be affecting the international migration patterns. And then we can also look at the, why, like the tying it to previous concepts, is to look at our demographic transition model. And if we take the, where people are coming from and why do they go to a new place, you're probably going to see a lot of stage 2 countries with net out migrations, that they are leaving for these new opportunities, and usually going to go to a stage 3 or 4 country where, so if you look at where those patterns are merging, you're probably going to see places where people are looking for new opportunity. And that very much fits what we're seeing in this image here, in the global migration. You can see where people are going are the most developed parts of the world in terms of economic wealth: Western Europe, North America, and United States. And not that there is another migration, but it's, if you look at those flows by the flow line map, you can see that here. And if we look at who's doing it, it makes sense on the economic connection. If you look at the migration and who's actually migrating, who these people are, and traditionally, that they're generally adult, fewer children, means that they're going to be contributing in an economic way. And generally, the young people that are seeking that opportunity. We talked a lot about an older generation not being as willing maybe to change if given all the factors at play, whether new culture, new language, some of those other barriers. And so, that has been the traditional model, but what we're seeing more recently is that that's starting to change. And we could specifically look at some of the Mexican immigration or immigrants that have come to the United States. Those traditional laws that E. Ravenstein highlighted are not applying quite as the same way as they had historically. And so it's changing a little bit. So hopefully that's a quick summary of the why people migrate. Be a good opportunity to go back and just kind of review your notes, and hopefully that helped clarify some of these ideas.